So far in this toolkit of developing a research project, we have looked at how to develop research questions, critical thinking and conducting literature reviews, designing a research project and the different types of designs that can be used, approaches to research, so undertaking either primary research or using secondary research, the different types of methods that can be used to conduct research, that's qualitative, quantitative or mixed, and resourcing a project in terms of time and labour. We now move on to look at what to do with the data we have actually collected. This is split into dealing with quantitative and qualitative data. In this slide series, we are going to examine quantitative data collection and management. And then the next slide series 9b, we're going to have a look at qualitative data collection and management. So methods of collecting quantitative data. The main method for collecting new data in quantitative research is through administering a survey. Structured interviewing and self-completion are the two main methods of administering a survey. Structured interviewing can be completed either face-to-face or via the telephone, and self-completion either postal, internet, and those kind of things. Both are valid methods of collecting survey data from respondents with their own distinct advantages and disadvantages. Of course, we can use secondary data sources too as a method of collecting quantifiable information for research, and we're going to look at each of these methods in turn. So surveys, whether being administered through structured interview or via self-completion, they follow the same principles, and that is that questions are usually closed-ended, with all respondents being asked the same questions using a fixed schedule or questionnaire. These principles have a positive implication for both accuracy and, importantly, the ease of dealing with and processing the data generated. Now, with structured interviewing, we can either deal with this via face-to-face or via the telephone for our primary collection means. If we're looking at face-to-face, the advantages to actually doing structured interviewing face-to-face are that all respondents are asked the same questions and in the same order, unlike in self-completion where respondents actually have control over the order in which they answer their questions. Sensitive topics. When exploring a particularly sensitive topic, the face-to-face method can in some cases be superior. You can of course also pick up on visual cues, probes and prompts. So interviewers work with the observed or visual cues that you gain from respondents, so it helps you to know whether somebody actually understands what you've asked them. And of course, working with these cues, we can then use prompts, so whether a respondent needs help answering a question, or probes to actually help us to generate further information. We can of course also use, when we're doing face-to-face interviewing, we can use visual aids, so we can use visual aids like such as flashcards, which often makes interviews more interactive, and that does actually improve response rates. The disadvantages to face-to-face structured interviewing are really around things like the questions and topics, the interviews themselves, and the resourcing. So for questions and topics, we're really looking at the fact that the wording, the formatting and the ordering of the questions needs to be good, it needs to flow well, and it needs to make some form of logical sense to the person that's being interviewed. Topics covered, sensitive topics, they can suffer very much from what we call social desirability bias. So you may ask somebody a question on a particularly sensitive topic and they give you the answer that they feel is correct for them to give rather than what they actually really think. Interviewers, of course, have implications on the standardisation and reliability of a survey. So inter-interviewer variability basically means that different interviewers, whilst you may have the same questionnaire to deliver, may actually end up getting different responses. So if you were to ask one person a set of questions via one interviewer and the same person the same set of questions with a different interviewer, you would probably get different answers. The interviewer effect is obviously the effect of the interviewer on the process, and that is really around the appearance of the interviewer. So how an interviewer appears can really influence a person's response. Now, resources, cost and time in comparison to other methods. So telephone and self-completion interviewing is cheaper than actually doing it face-to-face. Field interviewing is very resource heavy, both in terms of time and cost. Sometimes we actually need cluster sampling in field interviewing in order to control interviewer field costs. And field interviewing is also not particularly good for sort of accessing geographically dispersed populations because of the resource issues. Now, the other way of conducting a structured interview is via the telephone. Now, telephone interviewing has its distinct advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are, of course, around resourcing, so cost and time in comparison to face-to-face interviewing. It's cheaper, and it's particularly the case with it's particularly good for geographically dispersed respondents or accessing geographically remote respondents. It also means that you potentially don't need to cluster sample. With administration, interviewing from a central telephone unit potentially leads itself to more careful supervision and control over the interviewing process. This has potentially positive implications for standardisation and for reliability. The interview effect, telephone interviewing, it can actually mitigate against the interview effect, so you don't see the interviewer characteristics, and it can also have some effect on social desirability bias in that because neither the interviewer nor the respondent can see each other, it can enable sometimes people to speak more frankly. Some of the disadvantages about telephone interviewing lie around issues of access. So telephone interviewing is of course not appropriate for people who have hearing difficulties. You can't access people who don't have telephones, who are ex-directory or who operate on mobile telephone number only. There is actually no complete list of domestic telephone numbers. And it gives you some implications for sampling, in the fact that sampling from public directories may then be potentially weighted towards those who have telephones and those who don't, or who are mobile only, or who are ex-directory, and so on and so forth. So you may get people, say for example, you may eventually get a sample within a telephone directory that is based on an older population group rather than a younger population group who operate solely on mobile numbers only. Survey topics and anonymity. When actually sort of exploring particularly sensitive topics, the face-to-face method can sometimes be superior. Telephone surveys are actually neither anonymous nor are they personal in the sort of sense that face-to-face interviews are. So does that mean they're better or worse than face-to-face? Well, it sort of depends on the topic, but some degree of anonymity can be potentially good. How do you know which method? In this particular case of sensitivity, well, you really just need to explore that with a pilot and see what the results are out of that. Careful consideration needs to be given to the question type and the suitability for telephone interviewing. Ranking, matrix or multiple response questions are very difficult to administer over the telephone. Of course, interviewers can't work with observed or visual cues from respondents via the telephone. And you also have to think about things like question length. So how long is the questionnaire going to be? Lengthy telephone interviews are generally not recommended. Face-to-face can give more options with timescales. The quality of the data is potentially not as good as with face-to-face because you don't have the visual cues and because you can't ask sort of probe or prompt questions, so on and so forth. And also the response rate can be low when being approached by, sort of cold telephone calling, you do tend to get a large number of non-contacts and refusals. Now, moving on to think about, rather than surveys that are either done face-to-face or telephone, the second method of sort of surveying is via self-completion. So that's where there's no interviewer and the respondent completes the survey on their own. Now, the first method of self-completion we're going to have a look at is the postal survey, and we're going to have a look at the advantages and disadvantages of postal surveying. Now, of course, the big advantage to postal surveying, and the reason why it is used, is because of cost and time. So it's particularly useful for geographically dispersed respondents, okay, because you can send a survey in the post anywhere. It also means that you can send surveys to very, very large samples of people because the cost is relatively low. Time, respondents are able to complete the survey in a time that is convenient for them, which is not the case when you, say for example, are stopping somebody on the street, or you're cold calling them on the sort of telephone. People can actually complete a survey when is right for them. It does mitigate some sources of bias. Of course, you don't have an interviewer effect, you don't have interviewer reliability effects. So there are sort of positive implications for reliability and internal validity. With a lack of interviewer, there is the potential advantage with respondents who want to remain anonymous, that they actually do give information about a sensitive topic because they are anonymous. Using the closed answer questions, it means that it's easy to process and easy to analyse. The questions are completely standardised, which helps with reliability, and those types of surveys, they're pre-coded, and we use coding frames, and that helps to actually sort of impact positively on sources of error and intracoder variability, and so on and so forth. The disadvantages to postal surveying are around access. So it's the appropriateness for people who have reading difficulties or visual impairments, and also dealing with postal surveys in other languages other than English, making sure that your survey is accessible to the population that you're seeking to survey. Completion of the survey is one of the biggest disadvantages to postal surveying, in that you have no control over who actually completes the survey. Whilst it may get sent to the householder, it may be somebody else within the house that ends up filling the survey out. And what implications does that have for bias? With self-completion, there is no interviewer, so they can't help when a respondent maybe has difficulties in answering questions. This makes the wording of the questions particularly important for postal surveys. Wording has to be clear, unambiguous, and the questions have to be very easy to understand and answer. There also have to be very, very clear completion instructions. With self-completion, there is no interviewer to probe respondents or to elaborate on their answers, and this has implications for introducing any form of open-ended questioning within postal surveys. The other disadvantages to postal questionnaires are around things like the ordering of questions. So self-completions mean that questionnaires can be read as a whole. So that can actually influence the way in which respondents answer. So, somebody may actually pick up a questionnaire and read the whole thing through, figure out what it is you're trying to find out, and then change the way that they respond. Again, lengthy questionnaires are generally not recommended, okay, because respondents, more than a couple of pages, and people just throw the questionnaire in the bin. With missing data, when you don't have an interviewer who can probe and prompt and try and get more information out of their respondent, there is actually greater potential for partial and non-answering of questions when you deal with postal surveys, particularly around questions that are deemed to be not relevant by respondents. Sometimes when somebody feels that something's not relevant, by rephrasing it or by asking additional questions, you can actually get the questionnaire answered. You also have to deal with low response rates. Okay, postal surveys generally have a low response rate when compared to interviewer-based surveys. You also have the question of who actually responds to the survey, in that those who respond versus those who don't, or those who respond to the survey are those the people who actually have the most to say, and what does this mean in terms of bias for the data that's collected. A low response rate actually increases this risk. So if you've got a low number of people responding, the likelihood is that the majority of those who are responding are going to be the people who have the most to say. Now, of course, we can do self-completion via electronic survey means. So we can do that via web surveys and email surveys. These are becoming more and more widely used. The advantages, so if we think about web surveys first, the advantages to self-completion via a web survey are that it gives multiple options for formatting. So you can actually make a survey look interesting and sort of enticing to complete using sort of radio buttons and pull down menus and instant tick boxes and things like that. There's of course room for open questions using specific boxed areas. It also, web surveys, they enable you to better format your survey for filtering than paper-based. So you can automatically, if you have a tick box that says you need to yes or no to a particular answer, if you tick no, it will take you to another part of the survey automatically, rather than on a paper-based survey where you have to actually read the instruction and move on to question 25 or whatever it is. They can also be programmed so respondents, they can't actually read the whole questionnaire, they have to answer each question in sequence. You also of course have instant access to the survey data, so it's collected and it's done so electronically and quantitatively, so you have that straight away that you can import into your analysis package, and of course it's very low cost. The disadvantage to doing self-completion surveys via the web are around the issue of sampling. So you generally have access to restricted online populations only, and that has implications for bias samples and generalizability. Of course, you may be using a web survey to access a particular population that is best accessed via the internet. So it is only a sampling issue if you are trying to access a population that does not use the internet. So it completely depends on your research question and what you're asking. There is of course the issue of accuracy of access to populations via email accounts, so people have multiple different email accounts at ISPs. Difficult to actually use probability sampling frames. So you're not going to be using that kind of sampling frame when you're dealing with a web survey. Confidentiality, there's always a data trace of respondents. It's very difficult to not have a data trace from when people complete a web survey. And response rate, there is evidence that it is the same or lower than postal self-completion. However, as I've just said, this is completely driven by the population that's being surveyed. If you are doing a survey of young people about a particular issue, then a web survey is probably going to elicit a far greater response than if you did it via postal. But if you're looking at doing a survey of people over the age of 75, then probably at this stage a web survey might not be your best answer. So self-completion can of course come in the form of email, as an email attachment as well. So you have embedded surveys, and they're very easy for respondents to return then attached surveys. So you have something that's actually already embedded in the email. Attached surveys, so you open up your email and there's an attachment you fill out and send it back. They're really easy to construct, and they're really easy to use in existing word processing packages and things like that, and it's very, very low cost as well. The disadvantages with email surveys, with embedded surveys, the way it's displayed actually depends on somebody's operating system. The response rate of both embedded and attached emails, it completely depends on the population, again, as does a web survey. Ethics, again, it's the same as a web survey. Electronic responses are never truly anonymous, okay, particularly with email surveys, as the respondents' email addresses are known. Again, we're dealing with the issue of self-selection. And whether people, if people choose to take part or not, then you actually sort of lose the ideal of randomness to some degree. Having thought about the different ways of collecting quantitative data, the next part is to actually deal with the processing of the data that has been generated. All methods of survey need coding to convert the data that has been collected into numeric format so it can be analysed. A codebook or coding frame is used to provide a framework for how the responses that are given to a survey question are prepared for analysis in a computer package. Surveys, whether administered through structured interview or via self-completion, follow the same principles. That is, that questions are usually closed-ended, with all respondents being asked the same questions using a fixed schedule or questionnaire. For closed answer questions, codes can be included next to the response category in the survey itself. This increases the speed of data entry and decreases the likelihood of data entry error. In addition, it also enables a researcher to check what type of data the survey questions are going to generate to see if this fits with what analysis the researcher envisaged doing with the data. Knowing how data is going to be analysed is essential to designing surveys. It influences the overall design, the questions used, and the ordering of those questions. This process has to be done at the start, not after the data has been collected. To begin coding variables within a survey, the first step is to know the level of measurement of the data that is going to be collected by that question, to check if this allows you to do with it what you want in terms of analysis. The level of mathematical scaling is about the level of mathematical precision with which a variable can be expressed. There are 4 levels of measurement that we deal with. We deal with nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Nominal or categorical data is data that comprises of categories that cannot be ranked in order. Each category is just different. Categories available can't be placed in any order, so no judgment can be made about their relative size or distance from one category to another. So what does this mean? This basically means that no mathematical operations can be performed in the data relative to each other. As nominal data has no order to categories, coding can be in any order, but good practice is to code in order of appearance. Ordinal data is data that comprises of categories that can be rank ordered. Similarly, with nominal data, the distance between each category cannot be calculated, but the categories can be ranked in order above or below each other. What does this mean? Well, it means that some statistical judgments can be performed and some limited maths can be performed. Coding is very similar to nominal variables, but coding follows the rank order, so from very satisfied to very dissatisfied, following the order of 1 through to 5. This ranking can run from low to high or from high to low. It depends on what is most appropriate. Ordinal data can be ranked. Similarly, interval and ratio data, or what we call scale data, is also operated on a mechanism of scale. The difference is that with interval and ratio data, the data is numerical and has numerically equal distances between each category. To code interval and ratio variables, it just simply requires the data value to be entered. For thinking about coding multiple response questions, so in those examples earlier we were just dealing with single sort of response questions. Here we're thinking about kind of multiple response questions. We're really looking at, so it's coding questions where a respondent can tick more than one or potentially all of the different categories. The easiest way of actually coding this is to treat each category as if it was a single variable. So if we take this example here, what mode of transport do you use to go to work? Car, bus, walk, taxi, or other. You may actually drive your car sometimes, catch the bus sometimes, and also you may walk. So, you may walk entirely, or you may have to walk to your bus, or so on and so forth. So you may potentially want to answer yes to 3. You would treat car as one variable and code it as 1 or 2 for either yes or no. Bus as one variable and code it yes or 2. Yes or no, 1 or 2, and so on and so forth. Of course, we deal, even in quantitative surveys, we do have some room for open-ended questions. So not all questions in a survey are actually close-ended. Coding these open-ended questions, we are going to talk about qualitative information, coding qualitative information in the next slide series. That's slide series 9b, dealing with qualitative data coding. The other thing we need to consider when we're thinking about coding is actually coding non-response. So how do we deal with non-response when coding? How do we deal with this missing data? First thing we need to think about is, why is data missing? There are different reasons for missing data, okay, and it can be if we actually leave the coding blank, okay, so if we just categorize, or we just leave it that nobody has responded and we just leave that particular coding blank, it doesn't mean that we can't actually distinguish between the two types of missing data that we have, whether that's because someone didn't respond or whether it's because the question was actually not applicable. We need to know this kind of information, particularly if there's a large population of non-response to a particular question, as it helps us to see if there are any problems within the survey. So are there questions in there that a large proportion of the people that are responding to the survey are actually deeming as being not applicable? So that brings you into thinking about whether your survey and the questions you're asking are actually being asked in the right way. We tend to code them with a negative number, either a -99 and a 98, or a 9 and an 8. So say -99 would be missing, did not respond, and -98 would be not applicable. Here's an example of a coding frame. So in a coding frame, we list our variable, we then list the question number and give it a description. We then pull out the codes that we're going to use for that particular variable. So in the case of, do you watch TV, video, DVD in your free time, we're going to give that just a yes or a no. We code our type of missing value, so we're going to have a did not respond, -99. And then we also look at the data type. So for the TV variable, we're looking at a nominal variable, and for the TV frequency, we're looking at ordinal. Having talked about collecting quantitative data through a survey method, of course data can be collected via the use of existing data sources and analysed as well. So it's not just through survey, you can use secondary research into existing data sources as well. Now, using secondary data, that obviously depends on the nature of the research. Using secondary data is, you can do this in a number of different ways. You can look at aggregate data, so that's data that has already been manipulated and presented in some form of summary table. You can look at sample surveys, so that's data from specific surveys, and you can also look at cohort studies, that's data from studies taking repeated measures from individuals over time. Now, secondary data cannot be undervalued. Much of the data that is generated from official, or what we call national, sources cannot be replicated by any primary researcher in terms of its robustness and reliability. So sometimes the secondary data that you can get from your official and national sources is excellent in terms of its quality, and you as an individual researcher would not be able to replicate that. The advantages to using secondary data are around cost and time. So there's potential for to have access to really good quality data at a fraction of the cost of primary research. Data from major UK surveys is readily available online from UK Data Archive. Quality of data, many sources, as I said, official UK surveys offer excellent data quality. These surveys have been tested for validity and reliability and all have very well adapted procedures for issues such as non-response. Of course, you can use longitudinal data analysis as well, so it can offer the potential for analysis over time. So for example, with the availability of surveys such as the General Household Survey, Census, Labour Force Survey and so on. It also enables you to, using large national sample surveys, it enables analysis of small or very distinct groups of people. It also enables you to reanalyze existing data, which can offer new interpretations of data, so it can provide new analysis of data. Now, the limitations with using secondary data are, of course, around not having control. So using secondary data offers the researcher no control over the quality of the data or the variables that have been included. You then have to deal with the complexity of data, so many large national data sets are very complex in their structure and require a period of familiarisation on the part of the researcher. And also we think about confidentiality as well, so all data that's collected, say for example by the National Statistics Office, has to protect the privacy of the individual respondent, whether a person or a business, which means that often data below a certain number of respondents is not released. Now, sources of secondary data, official data or statistics, they tend to come from governments, international bodies set up by governments and local authorities. Official data is not something that comes from independent research or universities or market research of the private sector. UK Data Archive, if you want to get hold of your secondary data, UK Data Archive is one of the best places to go, as it's a repository for all of the UK major surveys. You can download all the survey data sets. UK National Statistics is also another very useful place to go, as well as they hold information on everything that we need nationally.